Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
You know that feeling when you step into a room and instantly wish you'd stayed in the car a little longer, just circling the block or sitting in the parking lot pretending to look for your lipstick. That was me that night, standing in the doorway of the candlelit restaurant where my family had gathered like actors in a scene they'd rehearsed their whole lives. And as I took that first hesitant step onto the patio where the engagement dinner was already in full swing, I felt like I was walking into someone else's story, one I wasn't supposed to be part of anymore, except maybe as a footnote or an inside joke that no one repeats too loudly. I arrived last, of course. On purpose. I could say it was traffic, or the fact that I had to work late, but really, I just couldn't stand the idea of sitting there for more than 90 minutes pretending I was thrilled to celebrate my brother's new beginning with the rest of the people who had always treated my past like it was contagious. The hostess led me through a maze of two perfect couples clinking glasses and leaning in over overpriced cheese boards, and as I approached the table, I already saw the shift. My mother spotted me from across the room, and I watched her do that thing she does, shoulders back, smile up, eyes alert, like someone about to greet a visiting diplomat or a ticking bomb, depending on the day. She got up and met me halfway. That alone should have been my first clue. Judith never gets up unless there's a camera nearby or someone she wants to impress. She leaned in and gave me one of those cold, dry kisses on the cheek, the kind that makes you feel like you've just been stamped with something. And then, without a smile, without even the courtesy of asking how I was doing or commenting on the weather or the traffic or any of the other neutral, pre-approved topics we usually stuck to, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear and no one else. "Please don't talk about yourself tonight." That was it. No, "Hi, honey." No, "You look nice." No, "Thanks for coming." Just a directive, as if I was a server about to ruin the ambience by existing too loudly. Now, here's the thing about being told to shrink yourself. You can either take the hint, stay quiet, and make it through the night like a ghost, or you can smile, sit down, and wait to see who really has the most to lose when the truth finally leaks through all that pretty fabric. I smiled. A slow, small smile that didn't quite reach anything, and I followed her back to the table, taking my seat like a well-behaved problem they hadn't figured out how to solve yet. The table was long, narrow, decked out in rustic flower arrangements and flickering fake candles that gave everyone just enough glow to look innocent. Danny sat at the head of the table, next to Melissa, his fiancée, the reason we were all here, the one with the gold ring and the kind of smooth composure that either came from yoga or secrets. She was beaming in that effortless way that women do when they've practiced the moment in the mirror, and it's finally happening. The rest of the table was stacked with the usual suspects. Our dad, half listening as always, some family friends who barely remembered me, a cousin who asked about my job in a tone that made it clear she didn't know what I actually did, and a few of Melissa's people, all of them polished and laughing and blissfully unaware that the whole table was about to fall off a cliff. I was 3 sips into my wine when Melissa stood up with a glass in her hand, looking like she was about to make a sweet little toast about how lucky she was to have found someone like Danny. I half tuned out. I figured she'd say the usual, that he was patient, kind, a rock during hard times. And maybe he was to her. But before she even got to the second sentence, she turned her head, just slightly, and said the one thing that cracked everything wide open. "Tell them what you told me. Or I will." Now, I want you to really sit with that for a second. Because that moment, that sentence, didn't come with yelling or accusations or tears. It came calmly, like a choice on a menu. And that made it worse. Because it meant she'd thought it through. It meant she knew exactly what she was doing. Danny froze. Actually froze. Like he didn't know if he was supposed to laugh or run. His hand hovered over his fork like maybe if he just took another bite, the moment would pass. My mom's expression didn't change, not really, but I saw her mouth tighten, and I knew she was doing calculations in her head. How bad was it? What did Melissa know? What had Danny confessed? Was this going to be a mess she could still mop up, or was the stain too deep already? Dad adjusted his napkin, looked vaguely around like someone waiting for a waiter to save him, and Melissa just stood there. Still smiling. Still holding her glass. Danny's voice finally cracked through the tension, weak and uncertain. I don't know what you mean. Which was a lie. A lazy one. Melissa's smile tightened just a little. Yes, you do, she said, softer now. You told me what happened. You said you didn't mean for it to go that far. You said you regretted it. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was accusatory. Everyone else at the table glanced around like we'd been dropped into the middle of a mystery novel and had to figure out what page we'd missed. And the thing is, no one looked at me. Not at first. Because they didn't want it to be about me. But then Melissa turned. Her eyes locked on mine, not in anger, not in pity, but in something that felt like alliance. Or maybe exposure. And she said, clear as day, so quiet it hit like thunder. I think Sarah deserves to know you told me the truth. And just like that, everything tilted. Because that wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. And somehow, I wasn't just a guest at the table anymore, I was the damn reason we'd all been called here. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the version of the story I'd carried for over 20 years, the one no one ever wanted to hear, was about to crash into theirs. And when it did, not everyone was going to make it out clean. It's strange how certain memories cling to you not because of what happened in them, but because of how the people around you decided they didn't. I've spent years trying to convince myself that the things I remembered weren't dreams, that I wasn't fabricating them out of loneliness or bitterness or some twisted need to rewrite the past. But the older I got, and the more my family insisted on brushing it all under the expensive rug of our so-called perfect life, the clearer it became that the story they preferred to remember never quite matched the one I lived through. Growing up, Danny was everything a mother like Judith could have asked for, a golden boy in every sense, handsome in the clean-cut way that got him extra fries from lunch ladies, charming enough to talk himself out of trouble before the rest of us even realized he'd caused any, and just detached enough from his own wrongdoing that he never carried guilt, just inconvenience. He was the type who would lie without flinching, not because he was malicious, but because the world had never taught him to value truth over appearance. I, on the other hand, was difficult from the beginning, too observant, too blunt, too willing to point out when something didn't feel right, which meant I spent a lot of time being told I was dramatic, sensitive, or just plain wrong. There was one summer that still comes back to me in pieces, the way a song plays softly in the background and you can't quite place when you first heard it, but it drags something deep out of you anyway. I was 15. Danny was 17 and already acting like he was older than the rest of us, already talking about colleges that sounded like movie sets, dating girls who wore perfume that lingered in the hall after they left. Our parents were fighting a lot back then, something about money, something about a loan that went sideways, something that made Judith start using the phrase, appearances matter, more often than I heard her say, I love you. That summer, they left us home alone for 3 days while they went to some marriage retreat Judith insisted they needed, and I remember the feeling of freedom at first, eating cereal for dinner, watching movies too late, walking barefoot across the kitchen floor just because no one was there to glare at me for it. But then something happened. And the house never felt free again. Danny had a party. Not a big one, just a few of his friends, some girls, some drinks they said were just wine coolers, which meant I was supposed to think they were harmless. I wasn't invited, obviously. I stayed in my room, reading some book I no longer remember, trying to drown out the music that thudded through the walls like a warning. At some point, someone knocked on my door. I still remember how soft it was, like they weren't sure they wanted me to open it. I didn't. I just stayed there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't name. Eventually, I heard laughter. Then footsteps. Then nothing. The next morning, I found something in the bathroom that didn't belong to me. It was small, stupid, something insignificant, a hair tie, one of those glittery ones you'd buy in a drugstore six-pack. But it was shoved in the back corner of the drawer I kept locked. I asked Danny about it. He told me I was imagining things. He told me I was trying to start drama. He told me that if I kept acting crazy, no one would want to be around me. 2 weeks later, the rumors started. Not the ones about the party, that would have been fine. But the ones about me. That I had come downstairs drunk. That I had flirted with his friend. That I had said things, done things, acted in ways I didn't remember, probably because, as they implied, I was trying to get attention. Judith called it a phase. My dad said it was best not to stir the pot. Danny said nothing. That silence stuck to me like smoke. And what burned the most wasn't that they didn't believe me, it was that they refused to. Because if they had believed me, then they would have had to deal with the truth about who their son really was. And the truth, in our family, was always the enemy of stability. I tried, once, to bring it up years later, after college, after therapy, after I finally built enough distance between myself and the version of me they insisted I had been. I remember sitting across from my mother in a cafe, both of us pretending we were close, sipping bitter coffee and talking about weather and work and nonsense. I asked her if she remembered that summer. Her face went still. Not angry. Just closed. She said, "We all go through awkward times, Sarah. That wasn't anyone's fault. You were emotional." I asked her if she thought I made it up. She paused, only for a second, then said, "It's in the past. That's what matters." And that right there was the moment I knew I would never get the apology I deserved. Because it was never about truth, it was about maintaining the structure. I had disrupted the image. And in our family, you don't get forgiveness for that. You get rewritten. So I learned to carry it quietly. To sit at dinners and nod through conversations about Danny's promotions, his perfect new car, his latest girlfriend who baked cookies for holidays and made centerpieces out of cinnamon sticks. And now here we were, years later, at the dinner table again, only this time the script wasn't going to go the way they planned. Because Melissa, sweet, polished, pretty Melissa, knew something. And not just something. She knew my something. Because 3 months before the engagement dinner, I got a message on Instagram. It was short, direct, and terrifying in its simplicity. "Can we talk? I think I found something I wasn't supposed to see." It was from Melissa. I didn't respond at first. I thought it was spam or some weird prank. But then she messaged again. This time, she included a photo. It was a journal page. One of mine. The kind I thought I'd burned years ago. And in that moment, I knew the version they buried wasn't buried deep enough. Melissa had found it. And now she was going to make sure the whole table heard it. There's a very particular kind of silence that fills a room when someone says something they're not supposed to, and it's not the comfortable silence of people lost in thought or the soft pause of polite conversation winding down. It's jagged, electric, and almost physical, like the air itself has turned into glass and everyone's afraid to move too fast in case they shatter it and bring the whole facade crashing down. That was the silence that wrapped itself around the table after Melissa spoke, and what made it even worse was the way everyone seemed to instinctively pretend they hadn't heard her. Eyes darted to wine glasses, to bread plates, to the flickering candles that now looked less like decor and more like a warning, as if the flames were trying to whisper, "Don't you dare." Danny cleared his throat again, but this time it wasn't a nervous tick. It was a stalling mechanism, a pathetic attempt to buy time while he tried to figure out what version of himself would be safest to play in this moment. Would he act confused, like he'd been misunderstood? Would he play the victim, implying Melissa was overreacting or twisting things? Or would he double down and try to charm his way out of it with that hollow sincerity he'd mastered since we were kids? What he chose was worse. He looked straight at her, and in a voice too calm to be anything but calculated, he said, "This isn't the time, Melissa. Let's not do this here." Now, there are words that sting, and there are words that expose, but the ones that cut the deepest are the ones wrapped in fake concern, as if the speaker is the one protecting you when really, they're just protecting themselves. Melissa didn't respond right away. She kept her eyes on him, and something in her expression shifted, barely noticeable, unless you knew how to look for it, but I saw it. That tiny withdrawal, that tightening of the jaw, the kind of reaction that comes from realizing the person you thought was going to fight for you has decided to fight against you instead. Judith, who had been sitting so still she might have passed for a statue, finally moved. She reached for her wine glass, took a sip, and then, with the ease of someone who's spent decades cleaning up emotional messes with verbal bleach, she turned toward Melissa and said, "Sweetheart, I'm sure whatever this is, it can wait until after dinner." Let's not ruin a beautiful evening with something that sounds like a misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding hung in the air like a loaded gun on a dinner plate. I didn't say anything, I didn't need to. Melissa's face told me she'd heard that word before, probably in whispers or in passing comments, or maybe directly from Danny himself, offered as the softest possible version of a confession that wasn't really a confession at all. Melissa placed her glass down with a gentleness that felt dangerous, and then she looked around the table, making eye contact with each person as if to record their reactions for later. No one said anything. Not Dad, who kept his eyes lowered as if the pattern on the tablecloth had become suddenly fascinating. Not the cousins. Not the friends. They all just waited for someone else to carry the weight of the moment, too cowardly to admit that they wanted the truth, but even more terrified of what it might mean once it was spoken. And then Melissa spoke again. "I know about the journal," she said, and when she did, my chest tightened not from fear, but from something close to relief, because finally, someone else was saying it out loud. Danny's hand jerked slightly, knocking his fork against the plate, and he immediately reached for his napkin like he could cover up the sound the same way he tried to cover up everything else. "What journal?" Judith asked, and it wasn't a genuine question, it was a warning, the kind of question you ask when you already know the answer, but you're hoping the other person is too scared to say it. Melissa looked straight at her. "The one Sarah wrote when she was 15. The one Danny said was just teenage drama, but he told me that it was real. That he was drunk. That he invited his friends over when your parents were out of town, and something happened that night that you all chose to ignore." Every face at the table tensed in its own specific way, eyebrows twitching, jaws locking, fingers tightening around wine stems, and still, no one said a word. It was like watching a group of people cling to a burning curtain, because letting go would mean admitting the fire had started in their own living room. Danny leaned forward, his voice low and suddenly serious. "Melissa, stop. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand what was going on back then." And that was it. That was the moment when I realized Danny wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was just terrified that the narrative he'd built brick by brick over 2 decades was starting to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it except scramble for control and hope the room would stay on his side long enough for him to rewrite the ending. Melissa turned to me then, finally, her voice trembling slightly but steady in purpose. "Sarah, I believe you. I read your words, and I believe you. And I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I didn't want to believe he could lie about something like that." For a moment, the world blurred at the edges, not because I was crying, but because I was furious at how hard I had worked to convince myself I didn't need this moment. I had built my life around silence, around the comfort of pretending it didn't matter that no one ever acknowledged what happened. But now, here it was, someone not only saw me, but stood up beside me, and instead of relief, all I felt was rage at how long it had taken. Danny sat back, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he was being made the villain in a story he thought he'd buried, and then he did what cowards always do when the truth gets too heavy. He played the sympathy card. "I was a kid," he said, his voice rising slightly now, desperate. "We were all kids. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't think it would. God, I didn't mean to hurt anybody." But that's always the defense, isn't it? That they didn't mean to, as if the absence of intent erases the presence of pain. As if regret has a retroactive eraser for trauma. Judith finally stood up, but not to defend me. Of course not. She looked at Melissa, not with anger, but with cold disappointment, like a hostess whose dinner party had been ruined by a guest who dared to spill red wine on the good carpet. "I think this has gone far enough," she said, and I realized then that she wasn't trying to protect Danny from the consequences of the past. She was trying to protect herself from the shame of having raised a son who could do something like this under her roof. But what none of them understood, not yet, was that the damage had already been done. Not just years ago in that house with the locked door and the glittery hair tie, but right here, at this table, in this moment, when they once again chose silence over truth. And that silence? It had finally found a voice. And I was no longer afraid to use mine. There's something insidious about silence when it becomes a shared agreement, When the people around you don't just ignore your truth, but actively participate in burying it, digging the hole with polite smiles and vague reassurances, patting the dirt down with phrases like, let's move forward, and there's no point rehashing the past, until you start to question whether the pain you carry was ever real to begin with or just some distorted story you whispered to yourself in the dark because no one else would listen. For years, I carried that uncertainty like a second skin, always just beneath the surface, convincing myself I was the one who had overreacted, misremembered, twisted a harmless incident into trauma because I needed a villain to blame for the person I had become, a woman who flinched when touched unexpectedly, who never stayed in one place too long, who trusted no one fully, not even herself. But 3 weeks before that dinner, before Melissa stood up and shattered the brittle calm my family had worked so hard to maintain, before Danny's carefully curated persona started to unravel in front of our eyes like a thread pulled too far, there was a night that changed everything, even if it didn't feel monumental in the moment. It was a Thursday evening, one of those damp, heavy summer nights that makes the air thick with something you can't name, and I was curled up on my worn-out couch with an old sweatshirt pulled around my knees, half watching a show I'd seen 100 times because real stories were too unpredictable, and I'd had enough of unpredictability to last a lifetime. The message came while I was reaching for the remote. No greeting, no small talk, just a line that might have seemed cryptic to anyone else, but hit me like a cold slap. We need to talk about the journal. It was Melissa, and even though I deleted her number a year ago, back when Danny first brought her home, and I realized she was just another shiny ornament in the display case that was his life, I recognized her tone immediately. Polite but firm. Curious but careful. The kind of woman who didn't speak unless she'd already done the research, already checked the facts twice, already built a foundation too solid to knock down with a few well-placed denials. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. There are moments when you feel the past reaching up like roots through concrete, and your first instinct is to turn away, to keep walking, because facing it might mean tearing up everything you've planted just to prove the soil was poisoned all along. But something in me, it wasn't courage, not exactly, more like exhaustion, decided to finally stop running. So I replied, and 2 days later, we met in a quiet little coffee shop tucked behind a gas station on the edge of town. The kind of place where the seats squeak and no one looks twice at two women sitting across from each other in the corner with nothing between them but a chipped mug and a secret waiting to be said out loud. Melissa didn't waste time. She pulled a folder from her bag, neatly labeled, of course, and slid it across the table. I found this in a box in Danny's old closet, she said, her voice calm, steady, but not without an edge. I don't think he knew it was still there. Inside were photocopies of several handwritten pages, my handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years, looping and uneven and a little frantic in the way teenage girls write when they're scared and don't know who to tell. I didn't need to read the words to remember them, but I did anyway, because part of me needed to see them with adult eyes, to confirm that I hadn't imagined it, that my younger self hadn't invented the betrayal just to make sense of a world that had turned cold and unrecognizable overnight. Page after page detailed what I'd felt that summer, how I had locked my door not out of teenage rebellion but because something in me knew I wasn't safe, how I had seen things I couldn't forget, like the girl in the hallway wearing my sweatshirt, or the whispered jokes I overheard from Danny's friends when they thought I wasn't listening, or the way my brother had looked at me afterward, not guilty, not ashamed, but annoyed, like I had made things more complicated than they needed to be by not going along with the story everyone else was comfortable believing. When I looked up, Melissa was watching me, not with pity, thank God, but with a kind of haunted recognition, as if she had stumbled into a version of Danny she didn't know existed, and was now questioning everything she thought she'd understood about the man she was about to marry. He told me it was a misunderstanding, she said softly. That you were young, emotional, confused. But I read your words, Sarah. And I believe you. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to forget something real. That sentence, more than anything, broke me. Because for years, I had accepted the idea that no one would ever believe me, not fully, not without making me pay for it somehow. But here was this woman, someone who didn't owe me anything, choosing truth over loyalty, over comfort, over love. And suddenly, the anger I had buried so deeply I'd started to believe it had died roared back to life, not as fire, but as clarity. That's when I decided I wouldn't stay quiet anymore. I didn't tell Melissa what to do. I didn't ask her to confront Danny. I didn't beg her to call off the engagement. I simply told her the truth, the way I remembered it, without hesitation and without apology, and I watched her absorb it the way people absorb news of an earthquake that happened miles away, shaken, but still standing, not yet sure what damage had been done to the foundation beneath their own feet. She thanked me quietly and left. And I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she would vanish like everyone else who came too close to the truth and decided it wasn't worth the fallout. But she didn't. She showed up at that engagement dinner, wearing the same practiced smile, playing the part, until she stood up in front of everyone and said the words that split our lives into before and after. "Tell them what you told me, or I will." And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't been ready to accept before. That silence isn't just survival, it's complicity. And I had spent too many years surviving. It was time to start fighting back. There are moments in life that feel like standing at the edge of a cliff, with wind screaming in your ears and gravity tugging gently at your ankles, where every second you hesitate to speak feels like one more inch closer to falling, and yet, if you do speak, if you finally give voice to the thing everyone's spent their lives trying not to say, then you're not just stepping off the ledge, you're jumping, dragging the whole illusion with you. That was the silence hanging in the air after Melissa's words landed like a grenade in the middle of the table, and as I sat there, watching the color drain from Danny's face and the tension ripple through my mother's jaw like a crack snaking across porcelain, I realized that the only thing louder than the truth is the desperate scramble to cover it back up. For a long moment, no one moved, not even the waiter, who had approached with a dessert tray and then quickly retreated, clearly sensing that no amount of chocolate mousse was going to fix whatever the hell was happening here. Melissa remained standing, her hand lightly resting on the back of her chair, steady and unflinching, as though she'd rehearsed the scene in her mind 100 times and had finally arrived at the moment when the curtain would fall and the script would be torn in half. My mother sat rigid, one hand gripping the stem of her wine glass with the kind of pressure that would surely leave an imprint, her eyes locked not on me, not on Melissa, not even on Danny, but somewhere above the table. As if by staring just far enough past the people involved, she could pretend this wasn't about her at all. Danny, on the other hand, looked like a man in a rapidly shrinking room, his shoulders rising slightly with every breath, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite decide which version of the story he wanted to tell, whether to deny, to deflect, or to finally, for once in his life, be brave enough to face the consequences of what he'd done. But the thing about consequences is that they don't wait for your permission, and this one had been crawling toward him for years, growing sharper and more dangerous every time he smiled through it, every time he pretended it was nothing, every time he let me carry the weight of silence so that he could float above it untouched. "I didn't know it would turn into this," he said finally, his voice low and thin, the sound of a man who thought sincerity could substitute for truth. "I didn't think she'd hold on to it like that." There was no question who she was. I was sitting right there, still quiet, still watching, but the way he referred to me, as if I were some irrational memory rather than his sister sitting 10 feet away, confirmed what I'd always known, that to him, I had never been a person who needed protecting. I had been an obstacle, a problem, a crack in his reflection. My mother made a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a sob, but still said nothing. I knew what she was thinking. She was thinking of the neighbors, the church ladies, her book club, the way they'd look at her if this got out. Not with sympathy, but with the kind of scandalous pity reserved for women who let their families rot while pretending everything smelled like lavender. Danny looked at me then, finally, fully, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the math of shame and damage control playing out behind his expression. "I shouldn't have let it happen," he said, and the room flinched, because even that half-confession, that sliver of acknowledgement, was more truth than this table had ever been fed in its entire existence. I was drunk, we were stupid, it wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I didn't know what they were doing downstairs. I didn't stop them. I didn't think she'd remember. That last sentence hit me like a slow-moving blade, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. I didn't think she'd remember. That was the root of it, wasn't it? The assumption, the gamble, the arrogant belief that if no one acknowledged the wound, it wouldn't scar. That if the story wasn't retold, it would simply evaporate. But memory doesn't evaporate. It lingers. And now I had a choice. I could sit there and let his half-truth become the final word, let him play the coward's version of accountability while the rest of the table patted him on the back for being honest. Or I could do what no one else had ever done for me, I could finish the story. So I stood up. Slowly, deliberately. The movement alone was enough to shift the air in the room again, like someone had opened a window and let the storm in. Danny looked up at me with the wide-eyed dread of a man who's just remembered the body is still buried in his own backyard. Melissa didn't move. Judith whispered my name once, not in protest, but in that same weary, warning tone she used the night she told me to keep my voice down when the cops came knocking. I remember everything I said, not loudly, but clearly. I remember the way the house smelled that night, cheap liquor and body spray and something burnt in the oven. I remember waking up to a girl crying in the hallway, wearing my sweatshirt, barefoot, trying to find her phone. I remember hearing the door slam after she left. I remember asking you what happened, and you told me to mind my own business. I remember Mom asking me why I was being difficult when I said I didn't feel safe anymore. I remember writing it all down in my journal because I was too scared to say it out loud. I turned toward Judith then. She didn't meet my eyes. I remember the look on your face when I tried to show you the journal. Like I was attacking you. Like I was embarrassing you. Like what hurt me had somehow happened to you. And I remember realizing in that moment that the only thing worse than what Danny did was knowing that you would never, ever believe me. Because believing me meant facing the truth about your perfect son. And you weren't strong enough to do that. No one interrupted. No one defended him. Not this time. Danny sat in stunned silence, his mask finally cracked, and I felt no vindication in the look on his face, just a tired, familiar ache. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about finally hearing the sound of my own voice echo off the walls that once swallowed it whole. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't. Because just as I reached for my purse, ready to leave them to their shame, Melissa spoke again. Quiet. Firm. I'm not marrying you, she said to Danny, her voice shaking now, but not from fear, from release. I'm not building a life with someone who thinks silence is a solution. I believed you and you lied. And now I know who you really are. And with that, she stood up, straightened her dress, and walked away. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just done. And for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like the one who was leaving broken. Because this time, I wasn't the only one who refused to stay silent. And in the end, maybe that's the real revenge, not screaming, not burning bridges, not watching them fall apart. But finally being heard. And walking away with nothing left to prove.